They want to be dismissive and talk about it as just being, you know, a handful of corporate environmental interests that are sitting down and driving all of this. But it's much larger than that. I mean, California's status in agricultural production is unique for a variety of reasons, one of which is the climate that we enjoy so much. It's one of 5 Mediterranean climates in the world. It's the only one in North America that allows us to do this. And why is that important? You all remember the food pyramid a few years ago. USDA sat down and moved from that to the daily allowance recommendations, and they did an interesting study at the time that they did that. What if, just by some crazy happenstance, each American chose to follow the daily guidelines? How many acres of fruits and vegetables would we need in the nation? And that, what they found was we're short 13 million acres of fruits and vegetables, healthy, affordable fruits and vegetables. And so, you know, that's several Californias. And so maybe we shouldn't treat the one that we have so shabbily in this regard. So anyways, I'm happy to take any questions. I do want to reiterate that we are here to be helpful, creative, supportive, and looking forward to Tim better explaining it, but want to just make sure that folks kind of understand the realities and the context that we have to work in. So thank you.
Do I have 5 minutes? I know why you do that. I know. All right, so this is kind of a rambling little dialogue kind of story. So if you have any questions at any time, just interrupt and I'll respond to your questions.
But it's a good one.
Well, it's an interesting one, depending on your perspective. So back in January and February, Mr. Birmingham and Mr. Patterson and I were having discussions about the upcoming water year, what that water year looked like, transfers, the ability to move water, and what could be done to effectuate making water available not only to the west side but to state water project contractors and others. The initial discussions were fairly bleak because at the time in February things were turning dry, and it got drier and it got drier and it got drier. And so the ability to move water from the San Joaquin River into the Delta and through the pumps in a manner to effectuate a transfer did not appear to be forthcoming. What happened at the same time as that was moving forward is every month, so you know, starting in February, the Bureau makes an initial statement to Oakdale and South San Joaquin about how much water is flown into New Melones, what the projected runoff looks like. Oakdale and South San Joaquin have an agreement with the Bureau in settlement of the protests and to allow New Melones to be built and permitted, that entitles the districts to the first 600,000 acre feet of inflow and projected inflow into New Melones in a water year. So that's an important number. Keep that in the back of your mind. So the process starts to move forward, and one of my other pet peeves, and I've been here for 2 years and talking about this, is your water master has worked very hard to try to get the Bureau of Reclamation to meet the April-May pulse flow requirement on the San Joaquin River, though there are logistical and legal differences. So that was one of the discussion items that came up, and I started having discussions, Oakdale and South San Joaquin, with the Bureau. The SJTA started having discussions with the Bureau about what the Bureau was going to do to meet the April-May pulse flow requirement required under D1641. We moved down the line. March was another terrible month, and we get to April. So in April, it became apparent that the Bureau was not going to be able to meet the April-May pulse flow requirement, given the releases that they were going to be making from the Stanislaus River, plus the releases on the Tuolumne and the Merced, plus accretions. The April-May pulse flow would not be met. The other side of the aisle, on the export side, was in more dire need of water more than ever, because in March they were told that they were going to have a 20% allocation, and it was looking bad. And at that time in March, the Bureau had informed Oakdale and South San Joaquin that at a 50% exceedance forecast, the districts would be right around 620,000 acre feet of projected inflow into New Melones for the year. So we'd get our 600,000. So the districts were sitting fairly good come the end of March, thinking they're going to get a full supply. We were going to look at ways that we could effectuate helping others out. So what came up is that under D1641, the state board has an EI ratio in a critically dry year, and that's export to inflow ratio of 1-to-1 on the San Joaquin River during the April-May pulse flow. So if there's 2,000 CFS of inflow on the San Joaquin River on, let's say, May 1, the exporters are entitled to pump 2,000 CFS combined at the export facilities. So what we looked at is, rather than doing a transfer with all the baggage that are mentioned coming in with transfers nowadays, and we'll talk about that as a subset next, we looked at a provision where the two districts could release their water on the Stanislaus River. It would then flow down and meet not only the requirement at Vernalis, but if the EI ratio, if the inflow ratio increased, then the export people would be entitled to pump their water in the Delta, both CVP or SWP water in the Delta. So that was the general premise of the program moving forward. We started the program in the middle of April. The Bureau in Oakdale and South San Joaquin got flow recommendations from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe Roger's in the audience, and if Mr. Ganay, if I misspeak, he could correct me. They made a flow proposal. We basically accepted the flow proposal. We put it into place. And so the districts released approximately 2,000 CFS per day for 31 days down the Stanislaus River. Bureau water was on top of that water. I know that several of your board members made a trip down the Stanislaus River and fine in fast fashion, given those amounts of flows. We came very close to meeting the D1641 flow requirements at Vernalis. We were off by a couple percentage points over the 31-day period, but we came pretty close. So that requirement was met. Ron's not here, so I'm not going to talk about what happened at the pumps, but basically there were things that were happening in the Sacramento Valley at that time, which in effect made the water that we released even more valuable at the export facilities, because at the time when we started initially releasing this water, the Sacramento River was crashing, and given the inflow amounts that were occurring into the Delta, exports would have been extremely constrained without this water. So eventually what happens, though, is that the water was released, the exporters were allowed to pick up their 60 to 80,000 acre feet in the Delta, and hopefully, and they moved that south and were able to use it. And the D6, and we were paid, Oakdale and South San Joaquin were paid, and that money is going to go into our programs set forth in our master water resources plans. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum, and it's one of the, for those of us who remember that, I thought that was a great line, thank you. Things got drier yet. I mean, what happened, so we started out at Oakdale and South San Joaquin with 600,000 acre feet on April. Right now, the two districts are looking at about 530,000. Okay, so the forecast went to hell in a handbasket. So, and I don't want to get into the whole weeds about this, and if Ron was here, we could maybe do a better job of it. But what happened then is if we have a thing in our, we have a contractual obligation in our contract with the Bureau that entitles us to go into our conservation account in New Melones. This is the second time since 1988 that we've ever been able to access the conservation account. And we were able to access the conservation account in order to keep the districts whole. If we weren't able to access the conservation account, this year and the hydrology turned as bad as it was, probably all of my directors and my general managers and myself would all be terminated from our respective districts, because there would have been basically 70,000 acre feet less water, plus another 80 that we transferred. We'd be down 150,000 acre feet of water that we otherwise would be making available to our farmers. There's other unique circumstances this year. Oakdale has an annexation. That annexation hasn't come online yet. They're going to use approximately 25,000 acre feet. They're not fully online yet. They won't be until next year, so that amount of water was available as well this year. So it points a parallel. The other thing that I think, and this goes to the context of kind of bringing it back to your state board process, you know, if you take a look this year, and you should ask your staff, the 3,200 pulse flow would never have been met with a 35% unimpaired flow paradigm regime. Now, granted, we have a SOG and our COG or whatever you guys are going to put together on that, and it may be that they might have done that, but just 35% unimpaired flow for 14 days wouldn't have happened. Not only that, if we were at 35% unimpaired flow, we wouldn't have had water in storage to make available to, under our conservation account, to meet that increased demand. So one of the lessons, and I think one of the lessons that, and you're going to see it coming from us, and I've already talked to you about this, about these blocks of water, is if we're looking to try to maximize flow releases and maximize the variability of flow, it seems to me that given the paradigm that we went through here with the exporters this year, affords us the best opportunity to do that. The other thing that's interesting about this...
Repeat that again. Slow down.
Sure.
Do it again.
Take a deep breath. Slow down.
So
Well,
in terms of lessons learned...
yeah, one of the lessons learned is, so given this year, what happened is that if you looked, we have an analysis, and we're going to write you a brief memo about this, but what it shows is if you did 35% this year, what you would have gotten for analysis. So we're going to show you that. We'll have a nice little graph. And then we'll show you what the pulse flow looks like. Now, you're exactly right. Your COG could come together and figure out that you have water from February through May, and you could have compiled that together and done these flows differently. You could do that, okay? And if there was people worked together and everything worked fine, but if it's just 35% unimpaired flow, 14-day running average, you don't get there. So one of the things to look at is this block of water concept, where you do have blocks that you can make larger pulse flows available for shorter duration time periods and move fish out. The other thing that we learned, and actually based on these discussions, I'm going to switch one more time to another subject, BDCP. So in BDCP, as I mentioned earlier, the flow requirements are March, April, and May. We have, based on what we started this year, we are in discussions on the San Joaquin tributaries with the export community about exploring alternatives of meeting delta flow requirements, outflow requirements, and export requirements. So we're having discussions about that, and on a monetary basis, where the export community would look at paying for additional releases of water that effectuate both a environmental need and maybe an export need. So the way we commonly look at that is there's probably an environmental need, which is you release water, it's delta outflow, it just goes to the bay. There's a component like we had this year where we can release water is released, and that allows the exporters to then export their water. There's a third component, which is we release water, and some of that water, given the what you end up with here at the state board as objectives, might be able to be pumped and partially used. So like in BDCP, to give you an example right now, the EI ratio is 65-35. So if we released an additional 10,000 acre feet of water down the river that hadn't been there before, and it reached the San Joaquin River at Vernalis, then the exporters would be able to pick up 3,500 acre-feet of water that they otherwise would not have seen but for that. So those are kind of the three regulatory components, and then on top of that would be a transfer component. So those discussions, much like the Delta Accord discussions, which led to the San Joaquin River Agreement, have a payment for water that lines up with an environmental objective. That's why I said earlier, and this will become more and more important as these discussions occur, that if your standards are not matching up with their standards and their needs and our releases and the fish biological needs, it makes it difficult to put a deal together. So we've finished the transfer. What came out of it on Oakdale at South San Joaquin is next time around we're going to be much more careful and cautious about what we think we have coming down the river. You never quite know, and I think that also goes to this risk-benefit assessment, and we have to look at risk and who's bearing risk when you're releasing water and how that plays in.
Can I just ask a question? Is just to presume this, but I want to make sure I'm right. The difference between the 600 and the 530 is that the Bureau changed their estimate?
Yes, the Bureau has, yes. What happened is at the 50% level in March, we were looking at about 610,000 acre-feet of inflow that had actually occurred, and projected inflow for the remainder of the year would have gotten us to 610. So what happened now is you already know what's in the bank and already it's flown in. What's happened is that the inflow amounts that are being projected have been dramatically reduced even under the 50% requirement. Things just turned so dry up in the upper watershed, and all the snowpack that was up there literally evaporated for the most part. So it was pretty scary. So I think that's the risk-benefit assessment is going to be an interesting question going forward when we look at, how we move water and when we're moving water. Moving water sometimes earlier in the year makes more sense than other years, than later in the year. And then finally, the outcome of this is if you look at New Maloney storage now, New Maloney storage has dropped precipitously in the last several months, and will continue to do so through the end of month September storage. And if Ron was here when we started this process out, we had no idea things would be that bad. We made our releases, we accessed our conservation account. All of a sudden, roughly 150,000 acre-feet of water that had been projected to be maybe up in storage in New Maloney's is no longer there. Plus, you have the deficit that the inflow that you thought was going to be there just isn't occurring. So New Maloney's does not look good. And then I have one final point, and I'm sorry to take up so much of your time.
Oh, this is good.
I think the other point that we learned from this is that these types of partnerships, and it's an unfortunate statement of where we are as a state and as agencies, this process works so much better than the transfer process. I think that it was unanimous around the table that what we've done to transfers and how we've burdened transfers and trying to get transfers done effectively, and I know this because we're in the transfer business, is you can't get them done. And it's very disheartening because it's part of our statewide policy that we should look at effectuating the movement of transfer water, and transfer water can be moved, can be bought, and can be on a fish-friendly schedule, but we can't get it done. We had follow-up transfers after this transfer that we were looking at doing. Both of them have gone by the wayside due to the regulatory constraints and requirements of other parties, and it's pretty bad. So my heads up to the board going forward, and you've heard it here already, end of month storage in September is going to be bad everywhere. If next year is even slightly below average, it's going to be a very difficult situation for the state, and we need to look at ways that we can better effectuate the transfers in the state than the current process.
Do you mind identifying, and this is just I'm not as up on this in this era as I was a decade or so ago. What are the key regulatory constraints that make it take so long? Just give me some examples. It doesn't have to
Okay,
be
well,
complete.
this is great being on this panel, and I look across the sea. So I'll give you one of my pet peeves, okay? No, Terry and I have had these discussions for 20 years, Jerry Johns and I. Refill criteria. So I'll give you refill criteria.
Okay.
So if you release water from storage, there's basically a requirement by some agencies that you have a refill requirement so that they're not impacted at a later date and time due to you refilling your reservoir with water that they believe that they would have gotten but for the transfer. Okay. Did I get close to that? Yeah. Ballpark, pretty close. Okay. So we look to move well, and here's what happens though. So we're doing a transfer we were looking to try to move an additional 10 or 15,000 acre feet to the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority this summer. And we ran into a refill criteria from the Department of Water Resources at New Melones. Well, the problem is Oakdale and South San Joaquin don't have permits to store water in New Melones. So if we don't have permits to store water in New Melones, how do we have a refill criteria? So there's refill criteria, there's this question about paper water, there's this question about consumptive use water, there's all these myriad of things that have come out. And all I'm saying is that we gotta kind of unshackle to some degree what we're currently doing with the transfer side of the aisle, or we should just not effectuate, because transfers won't be effectuated. Terry has a different perspective. They have a much different perspective.
No, I'd love just to start my neural nets
Yeah,
focusing on
and this is
issue,
gonna be an
'cause so
important
far
issue coming forward.
Those questions don't seem unreasonable to be asking.
Oh, no, well, I mean, if you look in the basin and in the watersheds, I mean, we're approaching already 1990, 1991 water surface elevations into month storage September. I mean, those are scary numbers. And if we have another below normal or dry year, we will all be back here in front of you looking for relief to effectuate moving water in a more expeditious and friendly fashion than the current regulatory requirements that we're under. And we're having meetings with DWR, with the exporters, with the Bureau to start those discussions to get ready for 2014. But
And I just want to make sure, this is on our radar, I know. And so I just want to make sure you know it is on our radar.
What's the it that you're talking about?
Oh, the need for
problem with
for
transfers?
flexibility. Well, transfers, but also just the variability that is occurring in the different months and that are affected by the different releases at different times. I mean, it's just, we're in a changing environment, and so Les, I don't know if you want to say something.
Yeah, we're
but
actually, and it's because one of the things that's identified in the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan, so we have started discussions with Department of Water Resources to see how we can improve transfers. So that is a dialogue that has commenced, will continue, and I concur this will be a difficult year.
I'm just happy somebody's listening to the Delta Stewardship Council, so thank you for that. That's the second time today you've listened to the Delta Stewardship Council.
so if there's no additional questions?
Well,
We may
I
come
have-
back to you. but
Yeah.
there's-
No, you have
Or
a question?
if you have a question now, go ahead. Okay.
I
See,
probably
Terry,
do need to comment here that
Hey, just be answering all of our questions.
since
that
Tim
we
set
have.
me up so well.
Yeah, right, yeah.
On water transfers, the state water contractors, and I think the CVP contractors generally, or CVP contractors too, I'm not so sure about them, but state water contractors are very interested in transfers. Our concern is that I think this goes back to the issue that the LAO and others have brought up about, some, 20 million acre feet the huge numbers of acre feet of permitted water rights in the Central Valley, and the actual water use is substantially below that. So there's a lot of reuse going on in the Sacramento Valley and the Central Valley, and so if there's not some kind of guidance on when a transfer really is providing real additional outflow downstream, not just instantaneously, but over the whole season, that's really what the issue that's out there is, and it gets kind of complicated. And I think our interest is in working with Tim and working with NACWA and the Department of Water Resources in figuring out ways to really efficiently come up with guidelines and ways to implement transfers so that we understand that we are getting some additional water, that this is not going to be resulting in potentially water coming out of our storage, out of the project storage at some point. And in the case of this Stanislaus River program, it worked out pretty well because I think we had basically the State Water Project, the CVP, both were getting benefits from the flow releases, and the impacts also were going generally to them. Where you get really to a problem is where you've got a member agency out of that's getting all of the benefits of the transfer, but all the adverse impacts are hitting the State Water Project and the CVP. So there's an equity issue there. But I'm sure it sounds like the State Board's going to be getting knee-deep into that here over the next few months. So we'll have a lot of chances to talk about that.
I was going to say armpit deep. You said neck deep. That's fine.
I'm here mainly just to answer questions, and I would, the state contractors have supported this program this year, felt that it was very, very good. We are also suffering from the dry conditions. Our allocation went down from 40% down to 35% as a result of dry conditions. And it's relatively rare that the State Water Project has any reduction in its allocation, but it's because the just the likelihood of this low of runoff was extremely low in January. I think there's probably, there was definitely less than 1 chance in 10 that it could have been this dry. I'm guessing it's probably in the range of maybe 1 in 100 or so. So this is really an extreme event. And in the Sacramento Valley in May, we had the all-time highest level of depletions ever. In June, we're on track to possibly exceed the all-time high too. So. Depletions it's the net reduction in flow that occurs between the upstreams, between the rivers, main rivers that come into the valley. So below Shasta, below Oroville, below Folsom, and you take that and then you subtract what comes in down at Freeport. And so the difference between those two is the depletions. In dry conditions. In wet conditions, it's accretions, so it's actually positive. But this year it was very negative. So that means that just kind of reflects in aggregate all the reduction in runoff and also the lack of precipitation to meet crop irrigation needs and so on, and high irrigation demands. Any rate, we are supportive of these kind of programs. I think these are going to be kind of they're going to have to be opportunistic. The circumstances this year were obviously changed, and we appreciate that Oakdale was able to follow through. Oakdale and South San Joaquin were able to follow through on this program, but it's something that we would like to work with people like Tim and other agencies and make these programs work more in the future. And that's all I have.
Well, I don't know if I was identified, but this is John Lehi with State Water Project, DWR. And I was here to answer questions as well. But I guess the only thing I have to add would, and Terry mentioned it, the 35% allocation for State Water Project matches the lowest that we've seen in the last 20 years. So it was a dramatic change to the water supply picture over the course of the spring as we've gone over. And it's proven to be quite challenging to manage that, and we've seen that with the project struggling with meeting the D1641 requirements here in late spring. I think from DWR's perspective, this purchase of water did fit nicely in meeting multiple benefits. As has been discussed, as far as, to be that there was less than desirable amount of flow for the pulse flow period this year. The way the regulations lined up, both the NIMS, some of the NIMS criteria for that ratio, that IE ratio, and the D1641 criteria, being at the 1-to-1, would allow for the incidental benefit at the exports to pick up some of this flow. That's what was envisioned. I think this flow also went towards helping to meet some of these D1641 requirements as well. In the timing of this water coming out was right when we were struggling with the salinity intrusion that was occurring in the late April, May period. So there was an additional benefit that we didn't foresee, I think, at the time, but it ended up being a benefit. So much of this water actually helped repel that salinity intrusion rather than the exports. So it was kind of a mix of both that occurred during the 30-day period. But again, I think in that sense, it was a win-win in that it was, we saw the migratory fish flows, we saw, some relief on the exports in this dry year that we're experiencing, and also helping to meet some of the salinity requirements and outflow requirements, X2 requirement.
That's it? Any questions?
I have a question about, kind of many questions on this notion of a transfer or calling it something else. It seems like a transfer by any other name wouldn't sound as sweet. So just trying to get a better sense of the comparison. So had you gone through, had you entered into an agreement for a transfer, would there been any difference in terms of setting aside the process of getting through a transfer? Would there have been any difference in terms of what the exporters would have been able to benefit from in terms
No.
of actual amount of water? So
No.
picking up at the pumps directly from the releases from San Joaquin as opposed to using the water for environmental purposes and then releasing water from Shasta, carriage loss, that sort of thing.
And if I might, I guess how I distinguish between just a traditional transfer and something like the Yuba Accord or what we were able to do with Oakdale and South San Joaquin this year is I view a traditional transfer as sort of a point-to-point exercise. You have surplus water available, I'm in need, and we're not really taking other management consideration factors into consideration. It just occurs, it occurs on the schedule that we can make it happen. I think that the added benefit or the power of the sort of approaches that we exercised here, Yuba, is that you are stepping back and you're thinking, how does this fit in the larger management context? What other benefits can we derive from these transactions? And not only does that make the best use available of the water, right? You're achieving and perhaps even avoiding, management conflicts, but it also minimizes sort of the social conflict that can be around a transfer, and that's a growing problem in a lot of places. And so that's, in my mind, the way I distinguish between the two. And I think as we learn how to do these better, what we should be striving for is trying to develop them into long-term tools, because so often we're in crisis management mode, right? And it isn't just philosophical that creative and cooperative solutions are better because we feel better about them. I mean, there are practical effects. The actions are more efficient. They are more beneficial. The costs of monitoring, the costs of ensuring compliance are all greatly minimized. And so it's beyond just sort of the philosophy of the approach. I think there's a real practical effect that we get out of it, too.
But why were you able to do this other than as a transfer?
I'm sorry.
Why were you able to do this not as a transfer? Is it because there were multiple benefits, so a
No.
bunch of different people said, oh, okay?
Well-
That's the piece I'm missing, the
You ready? Okay.
The
so
mechanism.
we're going to go to D1641 and Water Rights 101. Okay. So in D1641, there's a flow requirement at Vernalis 31-day pulse flow. So this year it was 3,200 CFS. The exports during the April-May pulse flow period under D1641 are entitled to pump 1-to-1. Okay, so if there's 3,200 CFS at Vernalis on day one, they can pump 3,200 CFS. The Oakdale and South San Joaquin irrigation districts have an agreement with the Bureau, the 88. They have senior rights. They took their rights, they bundled them in a package. The Bureau agreed to how we were going to release the water and make it available. But what it is, in the context is, we released the water at Goodwin. Technically, when that water was released at Goodwin, it was abandoned water, okay? And then it goes down. We didn't do a 1707 on it. We didn't protect it in-stream flow or any of that. We didn't come to you. We released it down the river because if we tried to do a 1707, we probably couldn't get it done in time anyway. So then it went down the river. It met the Vernalis flow objective. So once the exporters knew what the Vernalis flow objective was, and let's say we were right at 3,000 to 3,200, then they could go to the Delta, and based on their water coming in, they were going to pump their water at in the Delta. So they were pumping CVP and SWP water that was being released from Shasta, Oroville, and the American River. So that's the difference. If it's a transfer, our Oakdale and South San Joaquin's water would have gone all the way down, past Vernalis, gone into Old River, and then would have been picked up at the pumps and would have been Oakdale and South San Joaquin's water that would have been pumped, not CVP or SWP water. And see, that raises a whole host of issues that have to do with the coordination operation agreement, have to do, like one of the things that Terry mentioned, who's picking up this water, what interest is paying for it, does it go to the energy, does it go to the front of the pack, does it go to the back of the pack, who gets pumped first? So the easiest way, and this was a strange year, because there was 1-to-1, and we could do it. So under their water rights, they picked up their water, met your conditions for D1641. We released our water, which we're entitled to do because it's our water. We can do with it what we want. And so we released it down the river. We didn't come to you for 1707 because basically at that point in time, there's very little losses between Goodwin and Vernalis, since Vernalis is immediately downstream of the Stanislaus.
But what I'm not really following is why there aren't additional losses when you do it this way. Because there's just a lot more water moving around and opportunity for others to pick it up.
No, well,
So-
actually, it's an accounting game. And so it's not to be flip about it, but you're not incorrect, because when we send the water down in a dry year like this, and people are pumping and people are diverting water, and people between us and the transfer point, that was a real question and concern, because one of the things we heard if we did a transfer is we were looking at 10 to 20% depletions. So if I transfer 10 acre feet, 20 would have been bye-bye. Somebody would have been either paying for it or we wouldn't have been paid for it. Well, that didn't sound very good to us. So the component on this side was, on our side, we bore the risk upstream that what would happen on our farms and ranches at New Melones. Downstream in the Delta, they bore the risk that once we hit Vernalis, then they do their EI ratio and their Bay Delta mass balance and figure out that they can pump their water out. Now, as I said, and Ron could explain it, and there was some allusion to it earlier, April, May got kind of funky pretty quick with the Sacramento River and the amount of outflow that was occurring. So some of this water wasn't actually picked up. It was actually X2 and salinity.
So Dee, I think, there was a volume of water that was released and paid for, and then there was volume of water that was captured. My understanding, and I wish Ron was here, but my understanding is that accounting is still in place. We're not going to get all of what was released. There are losses that occur along the way.
But no more than what otherwise would have been the case if you had a transfer?
Correct. Well, we don't know
Actually,
that yet.
well,
Probably more.
I can expand on that a little bit. I mean, one of the big differences, I think the accounting for the transfers is at the exports. There's not going to be any accounting for this at the exports. The accounting was at the release point for this water because it was purchased to flow. The benefits were incidental to that. So for example, I think what we're going to see is probably as far as a direct, this did not play out, I think, as it was envisioned because of how conditions changed. That ratio was not controlling the operations for much of the period, so we didn't see that direct benefit at the exports that we had anticipated. So I think what you're going to see is that the actual exports was only maybe slightly greater than half of what the flow was. Much of this water, like I said, went to help meet some of these requirements. It's very possible we would not have met the Collinsville standard, for example, for a few days if this water were not in the system. So the other benefits to the system were really incidental to the flow that was purchased. I think in my mind that's the big difference. This is so, for example, the Yuba Accord water, there's no crediting for that water unless it's exported at the facilities. So that in my mind, that's a clear difference between the transfer of water at the exports versus, in this case, a purchase of flow measured upstream at gauges.
Right, which has multiple benefits that are of
Which had multiple
interest in
benefits.
addition to
And
just
risk.
being captured.
And risk, because see, I think
And
one of
risk,
the great
sure.
points that's raised is, you know, when we struck our capitalist bargain and then they paid us money, you know, it was with the expectation that they were going to pick up 60 to 80,000 acre feet of this water, or ballpark. I mean, you know, that changed, and they unfortunately bore a risk, and as I don't disagree, the numbers I'm hearing is they might get 50% of this water, but it had other benefits. But then on the flip side, we bore the risk upstream. So it's one of those risk assessment things that you do, and it may not always turn out, but the beauty of it is there's multiple benefits down the line their way and up the line our way.
So what I'd like to get is sort of a better idea of just how often this could be used. Are we being overly optimistic if we say that this could be a tool in, you know, many circumstances, or was this just a unique opportunity? And if not, if it was just a unique opportunity and it can't be utilized to any great degree, then I guess we have a transfer problem that we need to grapple with and see what we can do to facilitate the transfers. If you're saying that, and staff I know has been working on this, but I'm hearing sort of maybe differing views. If your assessment is that the transfer model that we're using, not we, just the state board, but the various entities that are involved, that it's not working from your perspective, because we've been getting updates about all these transfers that are moving through the system. So maybe today's not the day to go through all this in detail. Maybe we should have a more detailed discussion, because next year is going to be even more crucial.
Well, okay, and I agree with everything you said, and so let's go back to the latter point, though. And I go back to a point I made earlier. I don't want to get too far out in front of my export colleagues on this point. I know we are having, I know, as I was sitting between them,
When were
I'm
you
getting
going to
the-
channel Mr. Milligan?
It's
I'm
great.
waiting for that still.
Thank God Tom's not here. Okay, so, so one of the things we're talking about, as I stated earlier, is seeing if we can, in a regulatory context, be releasing water that matches up with BDCP. So like I said before, there's the outflow, it's releasing water so that they can pick up their water, it's releasing water so they can pick up some of our water, and then maybe there's a transfer component on top. So to the degree that March, April, and May on their side of the aisle matches up with our requirements for March, April, May, I'm not saying that you're going to go there, then that provides a synergy, because then if we release water and get paid for it, that, like in the Oakdale Master Water Resources Plan, we move water back upstream, we do conservation, we do these other things. So that's one of the benefits of trying to match up these and integrate the regulatory requirements. My hope would be is that this is not a one-time event, that as we move forward, that this would be an integral component of our resolution on the San Joaquin River. And then transfers would be on top of that. And I think what we're hearing from the export side of the aisle is that they want to look at not only regulatory flow, but transfer components in a long-term fashion, where they know in various year types and under various conditions, what water is going to be available to them so that they can make those choices. Conversely, it's kind of like an IID, then they invest in our systems, then we do the conservation, we do the improvements, we do what we need to do so that when they do make that call, we can make that water available, and we don't impact our deliveries to our farmers. They get the benefit. Hopefully we can do it in a fish-friendly fashion or a regulatory fashion, whatever, and that meets that benefit, and they can pick up some of the water. So I think it's a very integral part, and I think it's a new and recent development in the last 6 weeks that provides me some optimism about moving forward with a San Joaquin River settlement.
I think the one thing I'd add as far as from a transfer perspective is this year unique, and how often one of the other things that has limited our ability to use transfer water, you know, are the restrictions that are placed on the pumps and under the biological opinions. And so there are many occasions, more years than not, when we can't move the contract supply that's available. And so there simply isn't opportunity to move transfer water. Now, in years like this year, you know, dry years where there simply isn't enough contract water to move, then there are windows where transfers can move, but there's a tension there between that. In terms of a strict sort of traditional transfer, in terms of building the kind of, you know, actions that we did this year, I agree with Tim. There's a lot of different ways to step back and think about not only how we can operate the system better, but how we can create a synergy across standards so that they're more complementary. We don't get a standard in one region conflicting with, you know, a potential benefit in another.
Well, we clearly have to get better at this sort of thing. It's akin to the operational discussion we had earlier today, just because things are just going to get tighter, both because the fish are crashing and because climate change. So we do have to figure this out, how to maximize every drop we have. Well, great. We have one speaker card. Thank you. Mr. No, you stay, because he might be talking about you, and then we might have another question back. So, Mr. Jennings, please.
I'm definitely going to talk about my friend Tim. I mean, you know, Tim and I have reached the point where we could even write each other's comments. I mean, and in fact, you notice the similarity between his comments for most of the issues and our comments on the SED.
And then we're.
I'm delighted that that they mentioned that the 1641 flow requirements at Vernalis were violated this year, like the South Delta salinity standards that are being violated as we speak, and likely as the Delta outflow will be violated before the year's over. And that's one of the problems, is that we have had these long serial violations of the inadequate requirements in 1641, and no enforcement, and so that's a problem. Transfers, you know, we've got protests in now on a lot of the transfers. We've certainly litigated, we litigated the drought water bank and successfully, and you know, we've been trying to get the Bureau, we've been trying to get to do the environmental documents for a long-term transfer program, and we can't get the one through, and everybody's relying on these serial one-year emergency transfers that undercut the intent. I mean, I don't know how they can be, you know, emergency when we know that they're going to be used year after year after year. I'm delighted that they found a loophole in a way to export water, but it doesn't alter the fact that the system breaks down at the beginning of a third year of drought or a dry year. I mean, the system is oversubscribed. It can't work. And we are operating a system that if we have a third year of a drought, and God help us, if we have one of the 6-year droughts that we had a number of last century, as to what that's going to do to the system. I do point out that exports are surplus water. When we talk about allocations, I mean, that they never get 100%. I mean, it's always, and an allocation is based on essentially surplus water. You know, after the delta's in balance and after senior rights are taken care of. I mean, let's just remember, and one thing that we submitted in the San Joaquin project that nobody talked about, even in the synopsis, it wasn't acknowledged. You know, we went in and we dug up what are the water rights to the Central Valley. I mean, you know, we went through your files and all the old adjudications and filed a lot of Public Records Act requests and because you had told the Stewardship Council you didn't know how much water, and so we spent several years at considerable expense in coming up with 153.7 million acre feet of water rights, you know, for a Central Valley that has about 30 million acre feet of unimpaired runoff, about 34 million acre feet if you can consider return flows and groundwater pumping. I mean, so but the point is, that when are we going to address it? I mean, you know, we've known it for a long time, back in the 30s and 40s. In fact, in 1942, Henry Hilsinger, the chief counsel of the old Water Rights Board, your predecessor, wrote a report titled "On the Necessity of a Comprehensive Adjudication of the Sacramento and San Joaquin Basins to Support the Central Valley Project." In fact, Holsinger, when he was chair of the Water Rights Board, and then Governor Earl Warren, just prior to being appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, testified before Claire Engel's Congressional Committee that it's been long known that the basins were oversubscribed and that adjudication should take place prior to operation of the Central Valley Project. Well, of course it wasn't. And 10 years later, 9 years later, the state project was approved, predicated, as John Herrick tirelessly keeps telling you, on getting 5 million acre feet off the North Coast rivers that never materialized, and along came the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. I mean, we've been living in an artificial reality, a pretend reality, and at some point you're going to have to go back and address that. And this is through this process that we're going through now, the Bay Delta process, it might be the appropriate time to go back and try to bring the actual water that we've got into balance with the rights that we're granting out to people to water. And we can work it out. I mean, you know, Colorado did it, spent a decade doing it in the 1970s, but they resolved it. I remember Interior Secretary Salazar talking about what they went through. I mean, how his family lost some 1890 water rights and had to go back to some 1860 water rights. But they got through it. At some point, we're going to have to deal with it, because whatever is the outcome of the Bay Delta process, it's going to be more outflow. I mean, the consensus of all of the science is that we may argue over the number, but that there's going to be a substantial increase in outflow. I mean, the numbers that the agencies in phase one were no different than what they said in 2010 when we went through that broad process. So what are the implications of that? Where is it going to come from? How are we going to muddle through? We're going to have to bite the bullet. We can't keep pretending that we are living in a world of limits, and there is no pain of a solution. But anyway, thank you for enduring.
Thank you. Thanks for staying. Any other comments? Any questions? Well, thank you. My head is now full. It might explode, but that was very helpful all day and a very good space to be in. So thank you all for your time and your attention. See you all next time.